Genesis chapter 12. The Lord had said to Abram, "Go from your country, your people and your father's household to the land I will show you. I will make you into a great nation and I will bless you. I will make your name great and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse, and all peoples on earth will be blessed through you." So Abram went as the Lord had told him. Well, welcome Discovery Church. So glad that we can be together today. And I'm really excited about this new year. I'm excited about the new series we're stepping into, Unmasked. And I just want to know, hands up, who's wearing something that they got for Christmas? Anyone? Anyone get pajamas for Christmas? Are you still in your pajamas? That's awesome. Today's going to be awesome, and I'm just really looking forward to delving into the Word with you, getting into the story of Abraham. And when we look at Abraham, he's one of the characters in the Bible that is almost larger than life. But I think what we'll find today is that some of his reputation is probably a little bit more closer in character to what we really are as well. So let's get into it. What I'm hoping for today, that we will all come away with something that's going to encourage us and give us a bit more perspective and a clearer perspective on the bigger story that God's writing in the world that we're finding ourselves in. And maybe that's some of the key for this year. It's about finding ourselves in that story. Hollywood screenwriting teacher Robert McKee said this: "Stories are the equipment for our life. We hope to find in someone else's story something that will help us understand our own." And I think the story of Abraham, and maybe some of the other stories that we hear in this series, will help us to understand our own story as well. Today we're going to delve into the new year with the first book of the Bible, Genesis. Genesis meaning origins or beginnings or formation. And what we're seeing here through this first of the 66 books that make up the Bible as we know it is some of the most amazing stories and people that you could hope to meet. We're going to begin this year with the life of Abraham. And the amazing thing about the account of Abraham's life is this: there are so many parallels with our own lives that it's just uncanny, and it's really, really interesting. What I'm also convinced about is that the Bible is the collection of books that can be believed. Because like the story of Abraham, he's not being flattered in this story. There's moments where you just go, this is a guy who was said that his righteousness was accredited to him because of his faith. But there are times in his story when he falls down so bad. And so we're going to delve into some of that today. But if these are the people that God chooses to bring about his plan in the world, I don't know whether I'd choose them. So maybe that's what's most amazing about God, is that he uses everyday real people to bring about his plan in the world. In fact, 3 of the largest religions that we know of in the world at the moment find their beginnings with Abraham: Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. Christianity was, of course, we know, the direct descendant of Abraham, who was Jesus, was the one who began that movement. But Judaism and Islam were the direct result of the 2 sons that were born to Abraham, Isaac and his servant girl's son Ishmael. All those interesting things flow out of the life of Abraham, and that's what I just find fascinating. The different chapters of Abraham's journey are all covered with an overarching theme of the faithfulness of God and his continuing promise to just do what he said he was going to do. Even in the darkest and most hopeless of situations, God reveals himself as a promise keeper, and so much of the story of Abraham is actually not about Abraham, it's about God. So we begin in Genesis chapter 11. And if you've got your Bibles there, I'd love you to be just flicking through from Genesis chapter 11 all the way through to Genesis chapter 22. So grab your Bibles and read along. We find after the flood, Noah and his family have been saved in the ark. The ark comes to rest in the area of Ararat. And from there, Noah's sons and their families begin to multiply and spread out in the ancient Near East. Noah's son Shem became the patriarch of the Shemite people, from where the Jewish nation came from. And he also became the great-great-great-great-great-great-grandfather of Abraham. 262 years after the flood, Abram, as he was named, was born to his father Terah. Now Terah, it's widely known, as many people of his time were, was an idol worshipper. And because many people at that time worshipped many different gods, it wasn't uncommon for people to have many idols in their homes. And Terah was one of these people, in a similar way that the Hindu faith runs that we know of now. It's Jewish tradition that the story goes that Abram was only interested in following the one true God, and so he smashed all of his father's idols, except for the one. It may be that he already had some kind of contact with God, some sort of faith in him and some sort of relationship with him at that point, but none of that is recorded in the Bible for us. That's just Jewish tradition. But after moving from the land of Ur in southern Iraq to Haran, where Abram's whole family settled in what is now modern-day Israel, it was there that God would first speak to Abram, and also to make his first covenant promise with him. That must have been quite an experience for Abram. At that point, his whole knowledge of deities and stuff were all these multiple gods that everybody worshipped. And then all of a sudden, one day, one of them speaks to him directly. God says, "Go." That's what he says first. It's interesting that God gives him this direction first. He goes, "Get up, move." He doesn't give Abraham a destination, only the chance to trust that the journey would be worth it. I believe that God wanted Abraham to move with and leave his father's country, family, his household, and that community that he lived in, because God wanted to start a new life for Abraham and his household, away from the influences of family and the culture that was around him. It was a pretty big ask, and I can just imagine Abram's family when he tells them all, and the whole household, because it wasn't just his family. His household would have included men servants, women servants, that would have had shepherds to take care of flocks and herds. There would have been workers. There would have been people that would have put tents up and tents down. They were a big community in those days. And I think everyone must have had some massive reservations about what Abram was telling them about. But Abram does what God asks. And God lays out for him after that, once he starts moving, he lays out what we know as the plan of salvation for the world. In verse 3 of chapter 12, God says to him, "And all peoples on earth will be blessed through you." Maybe it's that action piece that we miss out on sometimes, because we're waiting for the blessing before we'll actually commit to something. We're waiting to see if it's worth moving for, waiting to see what the upside is before committing to it. But Abram takes God at his word and goes. What an amazing thing to carry. I can imagine that Abram must have spent a lot of that journey just thinking about what this all meant. Where were they going? What were they going to do when they got there? Why was God moving them to this place? What would you say if God came to you and said, "I want you to move because I want to bless people through you"? What would your reaction be? I bet Abraham lay awake at night a lot on that journey. It must have taken a massive amount of trust for him to actually act on this command. Go. Well, where? Don't worry about that. I'll show you. Really? Yeah. Man, take your family, your business, your super fund, your pets, pack it all up. We're going. Wow. Later in Romans chapter 4, verse 3, the writer there says that Abraham believed God and it was credited to him as righteousness. He trusted and followed God's direction. And God showed him places that he'd never seen before, promised the land that he came to his offspring, even though he had no children at that point. Maybe God at that point was alluding to the great nation of Israel that was to come, the plans that would be way past Abram's time. Abram's trust at the age of 75 and his humble and obedient nature is such an inspiring thing for us to look at. How do we measure up to that kind of obedience? So this will be the year when we're going to want to make as many plans as we can. And we're going to be tempted to control as much as we can in reaction to 2020. But I'd really encourage you to take a bit of a step back, take heaps of time to seek the Lord at the start of this year and see what he's asking of you. See if he's asking you to move on something, and maybe see if there's something that he's asking you not to move on. This could be a pivotal year for you and your family, and for me and mine, as we find out what God has planned for us. Maybe this year we could level up in our obedience and our listening to him. But the story of Abraham continues. Chapter 12, in verse 5, it says, they set out for the land of Canaan and they arrived. Simple. How easy was that? You just pack up and you arrive. I cannot believe that it has one verse for that entire journey for them. It's really, really funny. I find that so funny. It was so easy to move hundreds of people and thousands of head of cattle and herds and, moving tents and camels, and it was easy. They left and then they arrived. And as they came into the land of Canaan, Abram built an altar. This was to give thanks to God and to also recognise who God was to him. This was an altar that was meant to mark a moment in time, a spiritual moment for him, and say, God, thank you for getting us here, even if it only took one verse. So they settle in the land. They start to spread out and start to live there, and then a famine breaks out, a severe famine, the Bible tells us. So they move down to the southwest of the land, down towards Egypt, where there's plenty of food and heaps of supplies to be able to buy, and they live there for a while. And this is where Abram's story takes a bit of a twist. Abram, who had trusted God enough to leave his father's home, his community, his culture, and move his entire household to another country, falls over so badly. They go to a strange land. They had accepted the promises of God to build his family into a mighty nation. And he comes into Egypt and forgets all of that. As they get to the border, he tells his wife Sarai, hey, I know you're a beautiful woman. And what I want you to do is when we get into Egypt, you've got to tell them that I'm your brother. Why would he do that? That just sounds weird. I tell you why he did it, because he wanted to save his own skin. In those days, if a king or a pharaoh or somebody important saw a beautiful woman, they would take that beautiful woman and put them into their house, their harem, their life. And so what Abram didn't want was for the Egyptians to think, there's a beautiful woman. If she's married to him, we could get rid of him and take her. So Abram says, tell him you're my brother, and then that'll save my skin. What a catch, hey ladies? What a great guy. What a great guy to be involved with. Hang on a minute, let's lie so that I don't get killed. Win-win. But anyway, God had made his promise and he wasn't about to back out on it. God sees that he needs to step into this situation because Sarai has been taken to Pharaoh's household. Pharaoh, because of his favour towards Abram, loads him up with more wealth than he could even take. But God knew that this wasn't the right thing. So he steps in and brings plagues on Pharaoh and his household. Wow, doesn't that sound familiar? From a story a few hundred years later, it's about the same sort of thing. And so Pharaoh figures out, hang on a minute, this started happening when Sarai came into my palace and Abram turned up. I'm going to call Abram. He says to Abram, what have you done to me? And he's caught in a lie. He's He's exposed for the phony that he is, and he's kicked out of Egypt with his whole household. Luckily, with no other punishment than that. So Abram goes back to Canaan, settles back in, but because him and his nephew, who had been travelling with them from Haran, had so many head of cattle, they were actually struggling to feed them all, and it was causing a bit of tension between the two groups. So Abram gave his nephew Lot a choice. He said, "You can choose whatever land you want, and then you can have that land and I'll have the other. If you go to the east, I'll go to the west," and vice versa. So Lot looks around and he goes, that land over there looks pretty awesome. He goes, "I'll take that," and leaves Abram in Canaan. The interesting thing about this part of the story is that Lot chooses what looks good to his physical eyes. But in doing so, he settles in a region where his spiritual and moral standards will be most challenged. The people that Lot chooses to associate with and live amongst will eventually lead him to being robbed, kidnapped, having his daughters raped, and losing his wife in their escape from the area later on. Sometimes it's wise to be looking with our spiritual eyes rather than just our physical eyes. We can't always look at what's just in front of us. Sometimes we need to gain wisdom, and we've spoken about that. Wisdom is seeing things the way that God sees them. And I really think if Lot had have used some wisdom instead of just seeing what looked good to him at the time, he would have had a far less stressful life. But the story moves on. Chapter 15. God reconfirms the covenant promise that he made to Abram. Through a vision, God tells Abram of the things that are going to happen in the future to his descendants, telling of the slavery that the Jewish people would endure hundreds of years later on, but also to reinforce the promise that God would rescue them. God made his covenant again with Abram by laying out the halves of several slaughtered animals, then passing between them as a sign of that covenant being sealed. The interesting thing about this whole process of the way they used to make deals was that both of the people making the contract together should have walked between the animals. The idea of it was to say to each other, if I ever break this contract or promise, may it be done to me as what's happened to these animals here. But the interesting thing about this story is that only God passes between the animals. Abram doesn't. And it's a sign that God says, I am going to be the one who keeps this promise. Ultimately, as we know, that would be done through the sacrifice of Jesus years and years later. This process is also where we get the phrase to cut a deal. If you cut a deal with someone, it's this exact same process. And it moves on. Chapter 16. Isn't it funny when we try to take things into our own hands? Abram and Sarai try to make things happen in their time schedule by getting Sarai's servant girl, Hagar, pregnant. They try to speed up God's promise, and again, their trust in God and his promises is stretched to the limit. And by doing so, they will create such tension and hurt in their household because of their impatience. But God is incredibly patient, and he keeps meeting with Abram, reinforcing his covenant promises, and even giving him a time frame for when his own son would be born. God even changes their names to Abraham and Sarah to show how much he knows them and loves them and wants them to know that he wants them to trust him. Both Abraham and Sarah laugh when they're told they're going to have a son within a year. But that laughter of disbelief is turned to the laughter of joy when their son Isaac is born. Their trust in God rises as they see him come through and come good on his promises. But even before Isaac is born, and after moving to another region, Abraham repeats his old lie about his wife being his sister to protect himself from another king. King Abimelech, who ends up taking his sister to his place. Once again, because of Abraham's forgetful heart, he creates a situation where many people are put in harm's way. Have you ever gone to a lake or a pond or some body of still water and taken a pebble or a stone and thrown it into the water and watched the ripples go out from the spot where you've thrown the stone? This is exactly what Abraham has just done. He's thrown a pebble of faithlessness into the pond of his life, and the ripples get wider and wider, involving more and more people. God steps in again and confronts King Abimelech and tells him that he's a dead man if he doesn't give Sarah back to Abraham. And for the first time in the Bible, we come across the word prophet. God tells King Abimelech that Abraham is a prophet and he's going to come and pray for him so that his family and his household would be healed. And this title comes from the close communication that Abraham always had with God, the relationship that he had with him. He was visited to and spoken to by God often in the account of his life. And so he comes to be an intercessor for Abimelech, bringing blessing into his house rather than the curse that could have come if he didn't return Sarah to Abraham. What a humbling experience that must have been for Abraham. Again, he's been caught out in his lie, and now he has to confront the man who he's lied to and pray for him, that his family would be healed from the consequences of Abraham's actions. This part of the story also highlights the lengths to which God will go to keep his promise and plan moving forward. I think for Abraham, this must have been an incredibly transforming moment for him. And I think in the rest of his story, we find that he doesn't really lie again. He doesn't pull this trick out anymore. I think he's transformed by this moment. And again, God creates abundant provision for Abraham and his household, something that Abraham's actions had put in danger. And then in chapter 22, we come to the well-known story of where God asks Abraham to sacrifice his son Isaac. Isaac has been born and has grown into a young man by now. And such parallels to this story is the story of Jesus and the sacrifice that he would make years later on. I know Pastor Phil Hamilton spoke about this last year in one of his messages and how incredibly transformative this moment was in the story of God that was being told in the world at that time. Abraham's obedience in this story to God is another of the things that we learn from him being key to our own faith journey. So I think the lessons of Abraham for us come down to three things. Our obedience to the voice of God is paramount. Our trust in God who keeps his promises is foundational. And our belief in the story that God is writing will make our journey much more exciting and energizing. Firstly, obedience. We absolutely have the free will to listen to God or not. But it comes down to seeing stories like Abraham's, how much richer and fuller of joy his life was when he was following God's lead. Life just worked better for Abraham when he was doing what God asked him to do. And his household would have agreed. And everything he ever needed was provided for him. Secondly, our trust in God. This is definitely built over time, and one of the areas where other people's stories are so important for us. Hearing the testimony of others is so important because when we see in someone else the trust that comes from living a life in step with Jesus and the peace that passes all normal understanding that comes, it gives us such confidence to trust in him as well. This is why daily time spent with him, being aware of his presence with us all the time, is so important. And thirdly, our belief. Just stopping every now and again and looking back at where we've come from helps us to keep a perspective that is balanced and clear. When we see the footprints in the sand, as the old poem tells us about, and believe that it actually has been the Lord who has carried us through some of those seasons, our ability to believe grows, and our trust in him and our surety and confidence in God helps us step into the next chapter of what he has for us. And this is what the story of Abraham does for us. When we see him in ourselves and our longing to be close to the God of the universe and find that he comes to us, wow, that's amazing. He continues to guide us if we're willing to be guided. He absolutely keeps his promises. And the eternal life we experience right now is testament to his faithfulness. We see in this person of Abraham how similar his story to ours really is. Our faith to follow, our self-protective lies, our moral weakness, our desire to seek forgiveness, and when it happens, our beautiful obedience. All of us have these similar chapters going on in our lives. Abraham is such a well-known character in the Bible because I think he's more like you and I than any other character in the Bible. And I'm super encouraged by that. I really pray that as we go through this new year, as we go through this new series, that you guys will be equipped and encouraged to really find yourself in the story that God's writing for you. I hope you're blessed today.